Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, the show where we untangle the knotted threads of creativity and mental illness. Today we're taking a deep dive into Daniel Nettle's book, Strong Imagination, and we're going to tackle a question that's been bugging thinkers for centuries. Why does madness exist?
It is a real head-scratcher, isn't it? You'd think evolution would just kind of, toss those genes aside, the ones that make people more susceptible to mental illness, especially given how tough they can make life, right?
Exactly. I mean, it just seems like natural selection should favor, well, stronger minds, right? But Nettle kind of throws a wrench in that whole idea. He suggests there might be a hidden upside to these genes.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea for sure. Nettle's argument really rests on this notion that the same mental processes that can sometimes lead to psychosis might also be the source of creativity.
Oh, okay. I'm listening. But before we get lost in the weeds, maybe we should lay some groundwork. Nettle starts his book with a story about this guy, James Telly Matthews, 19th century, an inmate at Bethlehem Hospital, claimed his mind was being controlled by this device he called the heirloom.
The heirloom. Ah, yes, fascinating case. It really shows how even in extreme forms of delusion, there can be this, kind of an intricate creativity at play. Matthews actually made detailed drawings of this thing. He described how it could implant thoughts and mess with emotions using what he called pneumatic chemistry.
Wild, right. He even named the gang he thought was operating this heirloom Bill, or the King, Jack the Schoolmaster. Disturbing, sure, but you got to admit, there's some serious imaginative power there.
For sure. And I think the key takeaway here is that Matthew's case wasn't just some simple mental breakdown. His intelligence and memory were intact. It's just, his perception of reality had shifted. This really challenges that traditional idea of madness as a complete break from reality.
So are we saying there's like a spectrum of mental functioning with, say, psychosis on one end and what we call normal on the other, and maybe creativity finds its place somewhere in between?
Yeah, that's the terrain Nettle wants us to explore. He's suggesting that psychosis isn't a totally separate category, more like an extreme version of traits that are actually present in the general population, kind of like, turning the volume way up on specific mental processes.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see where we're going with this.
Mm-hmm.
But first, how do we even define madness in a way that, allows for this conversation?
Right. Well, Nettle mostly focuses on two categories, schizophrenia and then what we call affective disorders, like depression and bipolar disorder. These are the conditions most often linked to heightened creativity, even though they can be incredibly difficult for those who experience them, of course.
Yeah, we've all heard stories about, like, artists and musicians whose struggles with mental illness seem to fuel their work, right?
Yeah.
But is there actual scientific evidence to back up that link?
Yeah, there's a growing body of research that suggests there might be. But before we jump into that, we really should acknowledge this age-old debate. Nature versus nurture. Is psychosis mostly down to our genes, or is it our environment?
Right, that's the one that never seems to go away, does it?
Yeah.
Every few decades, it feels like the pendulum swings back and forth.
Absolutely. For a while, the focus was all about environment, things like your upbringing or childhood trauma. Then we discovered lithium and antipsychotic meds, and suddenly the focus was back on biology.
So where do we stand now? Is it nature, nurture, or like some kind of messy mix of both?
Well, twin and adoption studies have been really helpful in teasing these influences apart. And they consistently show a strong genetic component to conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Like, identical twins who share all their genes are way more likely to both develop schizophrenia than fraternal twins who only share about half.
Wow, so even when you account for their environment, that genetic link still stands out. But does that mean there's a single gene for, say, schizophrenia or bipolar disorder out there?
Well, that's where things get a little bit trickier. It turns out these conditions don't really follow those simple inheritance patterns like you might expect. Sure. We're not talking about one faulty gene. It's more about what we call polygenic inheritance, where multiple genes, each with a small effect, kind of add up to a person's overall vulnerability.
So it's less like a switch and more like those dimmer switches you see on lights, each one contributing a little to the overall brightness, or in this case, the predisposition to psychosis.
Perfect analogy. And instead of thinking of psychosis as this binary, like on or off state, researchers are starting to focus more on this concept of a psychoticism spectrum.
Okay, so it's more like a continuum of vulnerability with, say, normal people on one end and those experiencing full-blown psychosis on the other.
Exactly. And where does creativity fit in all of this? Well, remember those personality traits we were talking about? One of the key dimensions that psychologist Hans Eysenck identified is actually called psychoticism.
Okay, remind me what psychosis involves again.
Sure. People who score high in psychoticism, they tend to be unconventional, maybe a bit impulsive. They're often drawn to unusual experiences and they're not as bound by social norms. Sound familiar?
Yeah, I can see how those traits might actually be helpful for creative thinking.
Hmm.
But are we saying all creative people are just like walking around with low-level psychosis?
Oh, no, not at all. It's super important to make a distinction between uh, schizotypal traits, which are just a normal part of personality, and actual schizophrenia. Think of schizotypy as a spectrum, too, with some people exhibiting those traits more strongly than others.
So someone could have a touch of schizotypy that, fuels their creative fire without ever having a full-blown psychotic episode.
That's right. And it's important to remember that even within psychosis, there's a lot of variation. Not everyone with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder is creative, and many highly creative folks never experience a psychotic episode.
Right, it's all about those nuances, right? Understanding that complexity is really key to both appreciating the good stuff, the potential benefits, and also addressing the very real challenges of mental illness.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about mood. We've been talking about affective disorders. But what's actually going on in the brain when someone experiences, say, depression or mania?
All right, let's crack open that brain chemistry set and see what's inside. From what I understand, the mood system, when it's working right, it helps us regulate our aspirations and behavior. It's like an inner compass that guides us towards good stuff and away from bad stuff, right?
That's a great way to put it. Think of it as a system that tags our experiences and behaviors with, like, emotional markers. Positive emotions tell us, hey, do that again, you're on the right track. While negative emotions are like, warning, warning, danger ahead.
So when this system's humming along, we're good. We pursue goals, adapt to challenges, all that jazz. But when it goes off the rails, like in depression or mania, well, that's when we see those really extreme and often debilitating mood swings.
Exactly. Depression and mania are basically what happens when this delicate mood system gets thrown out of whack. They create these, like, self-reinforcing spirals, negative thoughts feeding more negativity and depression. And then with mania, it's like this excessive elation that drives impulsivity and sometimes even psychosis.
So it's like a feedback loop gone wrong.
Yeah.
Depression traps you in this downward spiral of despair, while mania is this runaway train of euphoria that can lead to, well, some pretty reckless behavior.
Yeah, spot on. And while we don't have all the answers yet, research suggests there's this complex interplay between genetic predispositions, life stressors, and neurochemical imbalances that contribute to these disorders. Serotonin, in particular, has been a big focus, especially when it comes to depression.
Serotonin.
Yeah.
That's the one Prozac and other antidepressants target, right? I've read that, boosting serotonin levels can really help alleviate those depressive symptoms for a lot of people.
That's right. But it's not just about serotonin. Dopamine and norepinephrine, they play a part too. Researchers are still trying to figure out all the complex ways these chemicals interact.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act,
Yeah.
right? All these neurotransmitters working together to keep our moods stable, kind of like a symphony orchestra.
Uh-huh.
If one section gets out of sync, it can throw off the whole performance.
Beautiful analogy. And don't forget the social and cultural context. Like, depression is more common in women than men in Western cultures, maybe because of a combination of social pressures, hormonal differences, and how they cope with things.
Right. And it's interesting, right? Like, while those major psychoses, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder, they have that strong genetic component, and their prevalence is pretty stable across different cultures. Minor mood disorders, like mild depression, seem to be on the rise in modern societies. What's up with that?
That's a good question, and one that has researchers scratching their heads. One theory that's been floating around is the genome lag hypothesis. It suggests that our minds, shaped by evolution to thrive in those small hunter-gatherer bands way back when, well, they're not quite equipped to handle the demands of modern life.
So basically, we're still cavemen and cavewomen trying to navigate a world of, like, skyscrapers, social media, and constant information overload.
Pretty much. The argument is that all the pressures of modern life, the demands, the comparisons, the relentless pace, well, it might be overwhelming those ancient stress response systems we have, leading to more anxiety and depression.
It's like trying to run Stone Age software on a supercomputer, bound to have some glitches. But if these ancient genes that can predispose us to psychosis are still around, could it be that they offer some kind of advantage, even in our modern world?
Now that's the question we're going to grapple with when we get back to strong imagination. So picking up where we left off, those ancient genes, why are they still hanging around?
Right, the million-dollar question. And I think this is where Nettle really gets into the meat of strong imagination. He proposes this idea of a compensatory advantage.
Compensatory advantage, meaning there might actually be a benefit to having these genes, even though they also make you more vulnerable to mental illness.
Exactly. It's like maybe there's two sides to the coin, right?
That's the idea. Nettle's suggesting those same mental processes that can lead to psychosis, well, they might also be what drives creativity. Think of it like a car engine. Too much power and it might overheat, break down. But if you harness that power the right way, you've got yourself a high-performance machine.
Okay, I get the analogy. But how does that translate to real life? How would these genes actually benefit someone, in an evolutionary sense?
Let's go back in time for a second. Imagine our ancestors living in those small hunter-gatherer groups. Survival back then took more than just muscle, right? They needed innovation, problem solving, the ability to think ahead, adapt to whatever changes came their way.
So a creative mind, someone who could think outside the box, come up with new solutions, that would have been pretty valuable to the group.
Exactly. Imagine someone who could make better tools, more efficient weapons for hunting, or come up with new ways to gather food, or even a storyteller, someone who could weave these captivating narratives that pass down important knowledge, strengthen social bonds within the group.
Yeah, I'm starting to see where you're going with this. Those individuals, because they were creative, they probably had higher social standing, maybe even more success when it came to, having kids.
That's the idea. And this brings us to Jeffrey Miller's theory of sexual selection. He's an evolutionary psychologist. And he argues that human creativity, all of it, art, music, storytelling, it's all a sexually selected trait, like a peacock's tail.
Hold on. Are you saying our love for art, music, all that stuff, it's all because our ancestors were trying to attract a mate?
Basically, yeah. Think about it. A display of creativity, it shows intelligence, resourcefulness, the ability to think outside the box. And those are all qualities that would be attractive to a potential mate.
It's kind of wild to think that something like art could have evolved just as a way to, show off how smart you are and attract a partner.
It might seem strange at first, but from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense. Those who could create and appreciate art, they were more likely to pass on their genes. So those traits got passed down through generations.
But if creativity is so advantageous, why aren't we all like creative geniuses? Wouldn't natural selection have just, favored those with the highest levels of creativity?
Well, remember, we're talking about a spectrum here. Like a lot of traits, there's a balance to be struck. Too far on the psychoticism side, and you risk, mental illness. Too far the other way, and you might not have that spark, that innovative thinking that helps you adapt and solve problems.
So evolution kind of settled on this middle ground, huh? Maintaining some diversity so those creativity-enhancing genes are still around, but not, to the point where they're hurting the species.
Exactly. And genes aren't everything either. The environment plays a huge role in how these predispositions get expressed. A good environment, supportive relationships, healthy ways to cope with stress, those can help reduce the risks while encouraging the positive side of creativity.
Okay, so it's this mix of nature and nurture working together, shaping not just our creative potential, but also our vulnerability to mental illness. But how does this all connect to that apparent increase in mental illness we see nowadays, especially those minor mood disorders?
That's a good question. And it's something Nettle touches on in his book. Remember that genome lag hypothesis we were talking about? Where our minds are basically lagging behind the demands of modern life.
Yeah, like we're still running Stone Age software on a supercomputer.
Yeah.
So the idea is that all the stress, the isolation, the constant stimulation of modern life, it's making those vulnerabilities worse, leading to more anxiety and depression.
Exactly. Our brains just aren't wired for this constant flow of information, the social comparisons, the pressure to achieve, all that stuff. It's too much.
But what about those more serious mental illnesses? Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Their rates haven't really changed much, right?
Right, good point.
Well,
And that might be telling us that while modern life might be triggering more of those minor mood disorders, the more serious ones, those with a stronger genetic component, they're not as affected by environmental factors.
so it's this complex mix, right? Modern life might be pushing people with those vulnerabilities over the edge into mild depression or anxiety, but those underlying rates of serious psychoses are pretty much the same.
Yeah. And we also have to remember that our understanding of mental illness has changed over time, right? We're better at recognizing and diagnosing these conditions now. And that might make it seem like they're more common than they used to be.
Makes sense. But even with better awareness and diagnoses, mental illness is still a huge challenge, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
No doubt about it. And while we've been focusing on this possible link between creativity and mental illness, we can't forget that romanticizing these conditions is dangerous. Mental illness isn't a requirement for creative genius, and trying to have psychotic experiences just to be more creative, well, that's just misguided and potentially really harmful.
Totally agree. It's about understanding how complex the mind is, recognizing that it can create both these amazing gifts and these really difficult challenges. And we have to support those who are struggling, make sure they get the help they need.
Exactly. And while we're still figuring out all the mysteries of this connection between creativity and mental illness, I think strong imagination gives us some really interesting things to think about.
It definitely makes you question some assumptions, right? And for anyone listening who wants to dive deeper into this, I highly recommend checking out Strong Imagination by Daniel Nettle. It's a great read, really gets you thinking about how creativity and mental illness might be linked.
Definitely a must read for anyone who's curious about the mind, how nature and nurture interact to shape who we are.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into strong imagination. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the depths of delusion to the heights of creative brilliance. And as always, we encourage you to stay curious, stay open-minded, and keep exploring this amazing world of the human mind. Until next time, take care.
So we've talked about the genetics, the brain chemistry, even touched on how evolution might shape this whole creativity-mental illness connection.
It's a lot to take in. But one thing I keep coming back to is, if these, what do we call them, these mad genius genes, if they can be so beneficial, why didn't everyone evolve to have them? Shouldn't we all be walking around with, like, a little bit of creative brilliance?
Right, that's where the idea of balance comes in again. It's like walking a tightrope. Too much of these traits and you risk instability, maybe even full-blown psychosis. But too little, and you might not have that spark, that innovative thinking that drives us forward.
So evolution kind of settled on a compromise, huh?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, maintaining a kind of diversity. So those genes are still around, but not so much that it's harmful to the species as a whole.
Okay, makes sense. But let's talk about what this all means. Like, if we accept that there's a real link between creativity and mental illness, how should we approach these conditions?
That's a big question, and it's one we need to be really careful about. On the one hand, we absolutely have to keep fighting psychosis. Support and treatment for those who are struggling, that's crucial. These conditions can be devastating, and we should never downplay that.
Absolutely. We're not trying to glorify mental illness or say it's necessary for creative genius. It's about recognizing that the mind is complex, that the same traits can lead to both amazing things and serious challenges.
Exactly. And on the other hand, maybe recognizing the potential upside of these mad genius genes, especially in their milder forms, maybe that could lead us to some new ways of thinking about creativity and innovation.
So instead of just focusing on treating mental illness, we could also think about how to nurture those creative tendencies in people who might be, a little schizotypal or thymotypic, but not actually psychotic.
Exactly. What if we created environments that not only supported people who are struggling, but also celebrated those who think differently, those who see the world in a unique way?
Yeah, like shifting away from just a medical model to one that embraces, what's that word? Neurodiversity.
Right.
Recognizing that different ways of thinking can actually be valuable.
Right. Think about all the people throughout history who might have had some of these traits. Artists, inventors, entrepreneurs, maybe even spiritual leaders. They had these unique perspectives, these unconventional ways of doing things, and that often led to progress, to a deeper understanding of the world.
It's an interesting thought. Instead of trying to make everyone fit the same mold, what if we embraced that whole spectrum of human cognition? Realize that those who don't quite fit in, they often have a lot to offer.
I think that's a really powerful and hopeful message. We need to keep fighting the suffering caused by mental illness, yes. But we can also celebrate how diverse the human mind is, all that potential for amazing creativity that's inside all of us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And for those listening, if you're fascinated by this whole topic, definitely check out Strong Imagination by Daniel Nettle. Really thought-provoking book, challenges a lot of assumptions about creativity and mental illness.
Definitely a great read for anyone curious about how our minds work, how nature and nurture come together to make us who we are.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Mad Genius Thesis. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the darkest corners of the mind to those flashes of brilliance. And as always, we encourage you to stay curious, keep those minds open, and keep exploring this fascinating world of the human mind. Until next time, Take care.